on our living ocean. Today, we are graced by a renowned speaker, Ms. Chetana Purushotham, with a passion of an explorer and educator with a lifelong fascination for life in the ocean. She is also a wildlife biologist, writer, and a photographer. Chetna is the co-founder of Spiders and the Sea, a social enterprise that aims to bridge the gap between the people and nature through research and education. She began diving in the Andaman Islands to study coral reefs after 2010 mass bleaching episode and ended up staying only for 8 years working as a dive master and educator at Dive India for 5 of those amazing years. Her primary goal has been to educate and excite people about the magic of the ocean. She is certain that a relationship and a sense of responsibility will naturally follow. Many times we find ourselves asking, what are corals? And what is coral bleaching? And is it true that corals are on the brink of extinction? Are what those creatures known and unknown are they deep in the ocean? What role do they play in underwater ecosystem? What discovery still waiting for humankind under those beautiful blue waters? Today's session aims to introduce as unknown world explored and seen through the eyes of this all-rounder enthusiast and a passionate naturalist who never stops learning. Her guru is none other than the Mother Nature. Ma'am, we welcome you with great zeal. Not delaying it anymore, we eagerly wait for you to proceed with your talk and enlighten us with this appealing world of our living ocean. Before that, there are some quick instructions for all the people who have joined. The chat and the mic will be disabled for the session until ma'am is speaking. Once there'll be the Q&A session as soon as her talk will get over. At that point of time, the chat and your mic will again get enabled. You can turn on your mic and ask questions, or you can put your questions on the chat box. We'll take anyways. Also, note down your questions and ask by unmuting or again putting it on the chat box. In between the session, you're requested not to hassle around. Also, the feedback form will also be given in the chat box after the talk. Please fill it up and help us to improve for the same. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Should I start or?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay. All right. Wow, that was such an amazing introduction. I feel really humbled and may not have deserved a lot of that. But I am also really excited to be here. I'll go ahead and share my presentation. All right. So once again, thank you so much, the Symbiosis Biodiversity Cell, for having me here. I'm truly really excited to be here and for this opportunity to talk about some stories from our ocean. And I've called it Our Living Ocean. So at first, it might sound a bit odd, but often I actually say it more as a gentle reminder. And this comes from the fact that even though I've been, raised in Bangalore city, which is landlocked, some of my most memorable times spent outdoors have been by the sea. So from as I think small as maybe the age of 2 or 3, I've been constantly going with my family out to the ocean, whether it's Chennai or it's Mangalore. And I would always be waiting to get into the water, be splashed around by the waves, dig tunnels, build sand castles, constantly bury the people who are around me. I would never be afraid or hesitate when I was around the ocean. But in all of those years, so this is even speaking early into my adulthood, not once did I actually think about what must be happening out there in the ocean under the surface of the water that I had seen so many times in my life. Not once did I actually wonder if there is life. Obviously, I knew there was, but I personally didn't seem to have any sort of curiosity the way that I had for animals on land. And the more I started to think about that, I realized that I wasn't alone. So even though we live in a peninsular nation with access to water very easily, for many people, for a whole bunch of reasons, maybe it is that sort of innate fear that many people have that's associated with water. It could be just, the lack of information, or the absence of an opportunity to be able to go to the sea, the way maybe some people who are always by the ocean always have. So for a whole bunch of reasons, our interaction with the ocean is quite limited, and to a certain degree, out of sight is out of mind, perhaps. But even then, there is so much that we know about animals like elephants and tigers even before we actually get our chance to see it the first time. But how is it that it's not the same when it comes to animals in the ocean? And for me, I reached this point much later in life, at the age of about 23, 24, which, when I look at youngsters right now who have taken diving at the age of 8 and 10, I actually really envy them, the opportunities that they're getting. But it was truly when I actually put a mask on my face for the first time and put my head in the water, when I actually had my mind blown. And this is an image that you already saw in the initial introduction, but this is really how I see myself when I'm in the water. So just, sort of suspended there, hovering with absolute magic happening all around me. So you have animals of all sizes, really small to really large, in different shapes and sizes, colors, patterns, textures, just going about their normal day, whether, it's feeding, it's schooling, they're fighting with each other, or they're helping each other. And it's a world that I was completely oblivious to all of that time while I was by the side of a beach. And the more I started getting comfortable in the water and spending time in the water, a lot of things started to make sense to me. And those pages from the textbooks that I, went through when I was in school and college really started coming to life. So crabs, for instance, were ones that we used to draw often in our record books. And very often they were actually not how they look in real life. And so one example I wanted to mention here is the hermit crab, which some of you may have seen if you've gone to beaches recently. So it's actually a crab that looks sort of like an ice cream cone. And it uses this body to then go and take shelter inside the vacant shell of a snail. So snails build their own hard calcium shell, right, for their own protection. But after they die, these shells actually are still of use for animals that need shelter. So hermit crabs have evolved to seek shelter in snail shells. And these are so important to them that as they grow through time, they actually have to actively seek out shells that are larger. And you can actually sometimes see hermit crab shell trains, because the moment, say, a large hermit crab has to move into an even larger shell, there are already individuals lining up for its vacant shell. And you can see this chain go all the way down to the smallest crab that needs to get into a slightly bigger shell. And these are animals that I was able to see very easily. You don't have to go down deep into the ocean to find them. And then I came across an even more spectacular kind of crab, a kind of hermit crab. So it is going to be found and spend all of its life inside a snail's shell, but it goes to another extreme to ensure survival. So it actually decorates itself, and not just with inanimate objects. It actually takes other living organisms, okay, from around it. It could be some kind of algae. And in this case, if you look carefully to the left of the screen, these are actually anemones, okay? You may have heard of sea anemones. Some people pronounce it as anemone. It's the same thing. So it's actually picked it up from around it and put it onto its back. So it's sort of like a win-win situation. So the anemone has a place to stay, which is quite firm, but the crab also is getting added layers of camouflage on its body, so it's a bit more safe from its predators. And so every time it feels threatened, not only will it go inside its shell and hide, but to the outsider, to a predator, it probably just looks like some sort of rock with some anemone growing on it, which it doesn't want to eat. And There are many examples like this, and one other that really blew my mind, and I was actually surprised by how surprised I was, given that when I first learned to dive, it was part of my master's degree, and at that point I did consider myself a student of wildlife biology, and I was also particularly interested in birds. And interested in birds because, again, there's so much of a diversity. You find them in different parts of a habitat. They look different depending on what they eat, and therefore different colors, and there's so much diversity in birds. But not once did I actually imagine that there would be diversity in fish. Fish, it's probably, looks like your textbook fish. And in the very first time that I went diving, I saw the most bizarre looking fish, and one of them being the lionfish. So it didn't fit any of the norms that I associated with, your basic anatomy of a fish. It had these colorful tassels coming out of the sides of its fins. It had these venomous spines going over the back of its body. It had these horn-like projections coming up from its eyes, and it had a beard. And these are all actually elements of its appearance that help it be an ambush predator in a colorful place like a coral reef. And if this is not bizarre enough, the next fish that I saw on the same experience was actually a boxfish. So, like the name suggests, it really looks like a fish that has swallowed a box. If you actually see it in real life, it actually is a cube-shaped fish. And it's sort of closely related to pufferfish, so the ones that always puff up in the face of any sort of threat. Boxfish don't puff up, but they have other, sort of weapons in their arsenal. One being their skeleton is almost like an actual solid box. It's almost like a hard carapace. So there are very few predators that would risk trying to eat this boxfish and potentially damage their teeth in the process. But if that wasn't enough, this really cute fish actually also secretes a toxic slime into the water when it feels there's a potential predator around. And this can be so toxic that fish can actually die if they come in contact with this toxic secretion. So not all appearances, give away all of the hidden secrets that these animals have. And they're only hidden as long as it takes for us to go there and observe them with our own eyes. And I'm not much of a seafood eater, but even then, to me, I didn't think there was really that much more to shrimp than seafood. But now that I have spent so much time in the water, they are actually one of my favorite animals to spend time observing underwater. So one way to go on a dive, similar to whether you're going bird watching, is to just, go on a trail and try to spot as many things as you can. Or it is to maybe not so much worry about how much space you've covered or how many different types of things you've seen, but actually find one or two animals and spend a lot of time with them. And shrimps are those animals for me. So this particular one is called the peacock tail anemone shrimp. So the name probably from the tail of this animal, which is on the right side of the screen. Okay, and it's called an anemone shrimp because it's there are different kinds of these, and they spend time on different types of sea anemones. So it's sort of like a partnership. It gets shelter in the anemone, which would otherwise sting other predators. But because the shrimp does this function of cleaning the anemone, in the process getting food for itself, this is sort of a partnership that has evolved over time. And shrimps can also be really social. And these are, again, some things that you can see even if you go snorkeling, or sometimes in tide pools where there's maybe even shin deep water, you can see goby and shrimp partnerships. So the shrimp on the right, if you can notice, its eyes are not that sort of well developed, whereas the goby, which is the fish on the left, has really well developed vision. So what's going on here? These are these are animals that live in burrows. You'll see them in any sandy patch, and they live together as partners. So what do they have to offer to each other? So on one hand, the goby is an excellent watchman. Its name is actually commonly the watchman goby, but it's quite a poor burrower. On the other hand, these shrimps, if you can see how solid their pincers are and their claws are, they're really good architects, and they're known for their perseverance. So it's not just creating a burrow, but in the sand with every wave, every movement of the current, it's almost like an avalanche of sand that goes back into the burrow. So it's constantly burrowing, using bits of shell and coral to, fortify the burrow. It's constantly working hard on burrowing. But because it has very poor vision, it could very easily become the prey of other animals. So here they sort of have a win-win relationship. They're not really doing each other a favor, but it's actually cooperation for mutual survival. And they're completely unrelated animals, right? Goby is a fish, it's a vertebrate, and a shrimp is an invertebrate. It's in the group of crustaceans along with crabs and lobsters. So how do they really communicate? Because they do. Because you'll see the goby constantly telling the shrimp, okay, the coast is clear, you can come back and dig and take some shells, or go back in, there's a predator around. And the beautiful thing is they seem to do this with touch. And if you look at the shrimp on the right, you can see those two long antennae, and they will always be in contact with some or the other part of the goby's body, even if it's the edge of its tail. And so you can actually see the goby sort of do a body wiggle or a jig, which somehow is able to translate into some useful information to the shrimp. Come out, go in, it's safe. And this is something you can again see with your own eyes. But some of the most fascinating phenomena around shrimps that I personally really enjoy is when they come together in very large aggregations. So these shrimps, at first, it may not be very clear to look at. They're almost transparent in their body. And they come together in these caves. And this is actually what you would call a cleaning station. So you will have, they're waiting now for much larger fish to come by, almost like a car wash. So what essentially is happening here, I'll play it again. You could have anything from a small snapper, a grouper, or a moray eel that will come park itself here, and all of these will get onto that animal. So research has shown that the shrimps merely walking on the body of larger fish gives them a sort of relaxing massage, okay, which reduces their stress levels. But they also remove a lot of the parasites and dead tissue, which for the shrimps are food. But for these larger fish, they're actually getting rid of things that might actually give them disease. So one after the other, you can actually find so many examples of animals interacting with each other. And it's not always a hunting, predator chasing prey sequence. More often than not, you can actually see examples of cooperation. And most importantly here is that shrimps really seem to have, very important lives that they lead when they're in the ocean. They have quite an important role in the ecology of the habitats that they live in before they actually reach our plate. And so at some point we get to that realization that, when we look at the surface of the ocean, how vast it is and how to a lot of us it brings a sense of calm. That's not all there is to it. It's not as monotonous as the surface looks. Sometimes we are able to identify that it's high tide because the water is rough, and sometimes it looks a lot more placid when it's low tide. But beyond that, there is actually so much life that is going on underneath. Okay, there is so much diversity. It's so vibrant. And with all of these words, I think one of the first images that comes to our mind would be coral reefs. Coral reefs are, I think, some of the most diverse ecosystems on Earth, and they're also known for how concentrated that diversity is. If you were to just sort of outline a 1 by 1 meter square on a coral reef, you will see so many different kinds of animals that are on the coral, inside the coral, under, that you, in many times, is supposed to be analogous to sort of 1 hour walk in a forest. So there is so much, life packed in 3 dimensions. But what is a coral reef actually? Right? So coral reefs are these ecosystems which have all of these different types of animals, whether they are vertebrate or invertebrate, but they're all living literally on the skeletons of corals. Okay, so in this photo, there are quite a few different types of corals. Okay, and there are some that are shaped in these form of small trees or branches. There are some that look like boulders. There are some that look like tables or plates. And each of these are actually alive. Okay, and they are colonies of the smaller animals that we call coral polyps. And so coral polyps are also just going through their daily life trying to survive. They're related to jellyfish and anemone. So they have tentacles that they will use to catch food, which could be small microscopic particles. But there is also a partnership here. So the color that you see on coral is actually a byproduct of an algae that lives inside them. So the algae is not living inside them to give the coral color. That just happens to be along the side. But because it's an algae which can photosynthesize, it gives most of the nutrition that a coral needs. And so this symbiosis is what has allowed corals to thrive so well. And in addition to provide protection to the coral animal, they build this calcium skeleton. So if you go back to the previous picture, all of these sort of hard structures that you see are the bits of skeleton produced by each of those coral polyps. And since they're living in the colony, it ends up, growing and emerging in the kind of shapes of all of these different colonies. And what ends up happening, you have all of these different complex structures being found, which are giving habitats to all kinds of animals. So it could be from worms to crabs and shrimps and snails to starfish, to urchins and sea cucumbers that now have so many different smaller habitats to choose from. And then you start to get fish of all different sizes, and then you can get reptiles, and then you can get mammals, and all of them slowly start to assemble in these places, but it all actually happens on the back of corals. So hence the term coral reef. But that's where it gets interesting. Not all coral produce a hard calcium skeleton and result in this sort of reef-like manner. There are so many different types of corals out there, and I just thought I'd share some examples with you, but it's not an exhaustive list. You can have soft coral that actually look like very soft trees that sway in the water. You can have sea fans, which are almost this sort of two-dimensional, the hand fan that we have, which usually grow against the current, so that without moving at all, currents bring nutrients and bring small microscopic plankton, which is their main food. You can have corals in the shape of cups, in the shape of organ pipes, some which actually almost have a leathery feel. And sometimes you can have like a garden of whip coral. They look like candy canes or almost like walking sticks, and you can have them for fields. And vast football field sized areas just with this kind of coral. So there is so much diversity out there. And coral reefs are also known for, spaces where you can find aggregations of fish. It could be really large fish like barracudas or snappers or sweet lips like in this picture, but they could be much smaller fish as well. So while these really large school of fish catch your attention initially, if you look in the background, there are all of these smaller, they almost look like French fries, but there's actually at least 5-10 different species of fish in the background right here. So an experience, even one experience in a coral reef can be quite overwhelming and addictive, because there is just so much to see, and at any given time, all you could get is maybe the duration of the stock when you go underwater because of how scuba diving works and your limited air supply. And you would need more than one lifetime to try and understand all of what is there to see in coral reefs. But then you start to see the numbers. Okay, whether you're talking about coral reefs that you find in shallow areas, which will usually be, in warm areas of the tropical belt, or cold water corals, which you will see in much deeper areas. So you can actually have deep water coral in Norway and in the UK, and even sometimes close to the poles. So, but even all of these spaces put together, it actually occupies a very, 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 very small fraction of the ocean floor. And we know that the ocean, that 70% of the earth is water and most of it is salty. So what lives in all of these other places? Are they just gaps of no life? Does life totally cease to exist outside of coral reefs? And that's when the journey of learning begins. Because while coral reefs are extremely amazing and they're probably the easiest place for you and I to go and explore, there are actually so many types of organisms and ecosystems that are just waiting to be explored. And even if you just start by imagining what the topography looks underwater, it's very similar if you were to look at how it is on land. It has all the same sort of contours and features. You can have slopes, you can have plains, you can have trenches, you can have mounts. So it is actually as undulating underwater as it is on land. And depending on where in the ocean you are, a different type of adaptation or lifestyle might suit you best. And one of the main things that really influences how life is in different parts of the ocean is light. So because of the property of water, a lot of the sunlight does not gets lost very easily. Once it penetrates in much of the shallow water, most of it gets scattered, and beyond a point it reaches the sort of twilight zone, and beyond that it could be just absolute darkness. But there is life in all of these different areas. So while we know that the coral reefs that are explained earlier, a lot of them are found in shallow areas, there are other habitats and ecosystems in shallow areas as well. And just a couple of examples here. One would be kelp forest, which you would find in slightly colder areas. And if you have come across the Netflix documentary, My Octopus Teacher, that entire experience takes place in kelp forests of South Africa. But you also have sea grasses, right? And the interesting thing is, even though kelp grows in this very forest, tree-like manner, they are actually really large algae. But sea grasses, on the other hand, are actually more closely related to grasses on land. So they have roots, they have flowers. So it's really interesting. And in India, we actually have vast tracts of seagrass, along the mainland coast, but also in places like Lakshadweep and in the Andamans as well. And once you say leave the coastline and start to go slightly out into the open ocean, life again does not cease to exist. Maybe the open ocean is not as packed with marine life as coral reefs are. They are actually still very important habitats. And even if you go to slightly more frosty places, there are so many animals and entire food webs that are built around sea ice and needing really cold water. But one of the most interesting ecosystems that I've come to learn about, and I urge everyone to actually, there's a lot of information available about this, are hydrothermal vents. Okay, so hydrothermal vents are nothing but spots in the deep ocean floor, usually around where there are tectonic plates constantly shifting. Okay, so what happens is that every time there is a crack in the ocean floor, and these can be as shallow as 500 meters but go down to 3,000 and 4,000 meters in the ocean. When there are fissures or cracks in the ocean, and in the crust there is a lot of pressure and gas building heated by magma, they're pressurized and forced to come out of these fissures. And as soon as they come in contact with the really cold water that is there at the bottom of the ocean floor, they start to give out this sort of smoke. And the colors of smoke can range from being white to gray to really thick black because of these sort of toxic chemicals that are coming out. A lot of the times they are different kinds of sulfides. And they then start to precipitate and form these hard structures. So it looks like these tiny mini volcanoes with these openings that we call vents. And initially, the first time they were found, actually quite recently in the 70s, scientists thought that this is probably going to be a very barren, desert-like area in the ocean. But actually, the animals that they found at hydrothermal vents, they're actually never seen anywhere else. They are called vent animals. They depend on the vent for their source of energy. So they don't require the sun. They don't really do photosynthesis. What they do is chemosynthesis. They're getting energy from the chemicals coming out of the vents. And there are some amazing videos that you can find on YouTube. So you could virtually immerse yourself in some sort of submarine and experience it. And a constant reminder is that the ocean actually does not end until it touches our shores. So in India itself, we have vibrant rocky shores, as we constantly see from marine life of Mumbai. Then we have these really large stretches of beautiful beach. And the very funny thing about beaches are, a lot of the times we think that we are the only ones there, but there's actually loads of life that's actually living in the sand and in the shallow parts of the sea, that probably if you just sit in one place long enough, they would start to come all around and you start getting comfortable around you. And the same with mangroves. So we actually have a lot fewer mangroves now in India than we did before. And in places where large stretches of mangrove have been allowed to sustain impacts of cyclones or even the tsunami of 2004, we have seen to not have had as severe an impact as they did in places where mangroves were removed or were absent. So these are all examples of some of the different ecosystems that you have in the ocean. So the entire ocean is not any one of these. And the really beautiful thing is that all of these ecosystems are actually interlinked. And mangroves, again, are a really nice example of that. So if you were to look at just that's, and mangroves may not actually be very deep, it could just be knee deep, but even those knee deep stretches of water are actually nurseries. Nurseries in the definition that animals from the open ocean or the coral reef habitats or even seagrass habitats, animals from there will come and spend their earlier juvenile stages so that they're able to survive without without the threat of predators as much as they would have had in the habitats that they spend as adults. So they usually will spend the first few weeks or months in mangroves, where they have the protection of the roots, they get enough food, but much larger predators won't come. And once they're large enough to brave the big blue sea, they will slowly head out. And these linkages also that the oceans have also go outside of the water. And if any of you have heard of the sardine run in South Africa, it's an amazing illustration of this. So sardines are these fish that come in millions every time there is a cold water current coming to the surface, which brings a lot of nutrients and which attracts the sardines to come and start breeding. But this is a natural cue for all of the other predators. It's almost like an annual feast that they get ready for. Everything from large fish to dolphins to sharks to whales, but most interestingly to birds. So these seabirds actually use these these large sort of attacks that are happening as a cue for them also to come and join in with the action. And another humbling reminder is that these ecosystems also shape parts of land that are very important to us. They actually, for example, when you look at coral reefs, in most places in India we have coral reefs that are quite close to the coast, and they almost in some places fringe along land, and they actually act as shock absorbers. Even though these are ecosystems that are submerged, they are actually protecting us from storms and cyclones and allowing the integrity of our coastline to remain. And this picture, if you're wondering, is actually of skeletons of coral that are above the surface. And I thought they would give you a good idea of what the hard calcium skeleton of hard coral would look like when those algae are not still in them. So this is a completely dead coral reef, a photo that was taken in North Andaman by Umeed Mistry soon after the 2004 tsunami. So in the Andamans, what happened as a result of the earthquake was it tilted the Andaman plate. So a lot of North Andaman in the tip was actually raised by almost a meter. So this entire reef is now permanently above water. And another, I like to call it a seemingly invisible connection, but one that is very much so that we depend on for our very survival, is the air we breathe. So just like how we depend on plants that are on land to produce the oxygen that we need to breathe, we now know that anywhere between 50 to 80% of the oxygen that we breathe actually come from the plants and the plant-like organisms in the ocean. So this could be the seagrass, it could be the various kinds of algae, but there's a very important proportion of oxygen we get that comes from extremely small, microscopic, almost invisible phytoplankton. So it's a sort of group term given to various different kinds of plant-like organisms. And you have there are different types of species. Some might actually be cyanobacteria. You have names like diatoms, dinoflagellates. There are all of these different kinds. They're called plankton because they more or less drift in the ocean where the currents take them. And they're really, really small. This is a picture that is taken from under a very powerful microscope. But together they provide anywhere between 50 to 80% of the oxygen that we breathe. So whether you're in a landlocked city or you're by the coast, in any part of the world, we actually have this sort of direct connection with the ocean even without realizing it. Which brings me to an interesting point. Very often you might read comments that we see, as humans, we seem to be more interested in looking for life outside of Earth, in outer space, looking for oceans on other planets, than actually spending time and effort to explore our oceans, which is really like our last frontier. And so to speak, we've not even scratched the surface of what's out there. And there are numerous discoveries that we are having every year that goes to sort of illustrate this. And there is so much of our ocean that actually looks like outer space, with this particular animal that is in the forefront, which is sort of on a stalk, is what they call the ET sponge. So it's a sea sponge that was found, I think, around 1,000 meters deep into the ocean. And it's called the ET sponge because it's got these two sort of openings which resemble the eyes of ET if you've seen the movie. And it's discoveries of animals that are completely new to science, or it's things about animals we didn't know before. So this is a particular shark called the kite shark. Again, it's found around 1,000 meters in depth. And we've found out now that they are maybe one of the largest animals that produce bioluminescence. You may have heard of bioluminescence. It's something that fireflies do, and you might have also heard of the bioluminescent waves that would come along our coast sometimes in the monsoon. So a lot of plankton actually produce their own light in the form of bioluminescence. It could be a way to communicate with each other. It could be a way of sending out an alarm. And in the case of the kite shark, it was a way to actually blend its body with the light coming from the surface. So if there was any animal below it that looked up, the kite shark would be sort of camouflaged thanks to its bioluminescence to light penetrating from the top. It's not that much light. It would be very little, but that could still be enough to blow the cover of this shark, which is a predator. And another interesting example that I wanted to highlight is sometimes we are constantly sort of correcting the things that we find about nature as well. So if any of you remember, many years ago, this was ranked the most ugliest fish. It was called the blobfish because, like, what is that shape? And it looks so slimy. But the more technology has developed, more people are able to actually study animals underwater in their natural habitat and when they're alive. There are things that we are learning about these animals. So the blobfish only looks like this because it was rapidly pulled up hundreds of meters from the deep ocean and its entire tissue composition has been damaged. But if you were to see it underwater, which is, at 3,000, so 3,000 feet deep, it actually looks like a normal fish, but living with such high pressure that when it was brought all the way to the surface, it was reduced to nothing but a blob. And closer to home, since we started off with coral reefs, I also wanted to end with how something so familiar to us, of all the ecosystems, if we think we know the most about coral reefs, there are still new things we're learning about how it functions. A lot of people who go diving would describe the experience as being, meditative. It's so silent. The only sound you hear would be of your own breathing. But it turns out that coral reefs are actually really noisy. And the animals on these reefs are actually constantly communicating with each other. They're producing sounds, they're talking to each other, but probably happening at frequencies that are not audible to us. But so I actually got an audio clip that I wanted to play for you. It's not particularly loud, so maybe you can increase your volume to as high as it's possible. And it almost sounds like a busy street that's undergoing that has traffic, but with animals. Could you hear it? Anyone can tell me?
We heard first in the starting something like quing quing like this.
Yeah, okay. I'll play it again. So just so that you can maybe have some visuals in your head, there are a bunch of sounds. One which sounds like you're frying something on a pan, or it sounds like the sound of rain falling. Those are actually shrimps. If you remember the shrimp that I showed you, that's with the goby, the watchman goby. Imagine something like that, but much smaller, maybe even smaller than your pinky finger, and hundreds of them hiding in the reef, like a reef like this. Then a lot of the grunts and the cackling and everything are different kinds of fish, and one of them actually is the clownfish, the one that you may know from Finding Nemo. I'll just play a bit more of it as well, so now you can just imagine some of these animals.
Okay, okay.
So coral reefs are actually really noisy. And what scientists have found is that having a lot of noise, which is basically the fish and other animals communicating with each other, is actually the sign of a healthy reef. And in places where coral reefs have died, possibly because of mass bleaching, which has caused the corals to die, and eventually all of the other marine life has vanished, it sounds absolutely quiet. And turns out that when animals are approaching or trying to find a new reef, they actually listen out for the sounds. So what some conservationists are doing is trying to play recordings of a healthy reef in a sort of degraded reef and see if that's actually able to encourage animals to recolonize that reef again. So new discoveries that are also able to help us understand how these ecosystems function, but also teaching us how we can actually help protect them and bring them back to life. And all of this exciting stuff, unfortunately, does not come without threats. And you may be familiar with a lot of them. Coral reefs in particular are have hugely been impacted by the increase in the water temperature, which before has actually happened due to global warming. So even a half a degree rise in temperature of the atmosphere has caused the water temperature to increase again only by about 1 degree. That has caused large scale stress to corals around the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, which is causing them to disband in that symbiosis, let go of the algae that was producing their food, and you can see that they've turned completely white. And a bleached coral is still alive. It can still use its tentacles and try and capture plankton, but they may not last very long, maybe maximum about 2 weeks. If the temperature is able to come back down and they can get new algae, there is hope that they will have a restored normal life. But otherwise we see large swaths of coral reefs just crumble after decades of putting that structure together. And on one hand, while you have threats like coral bleaching and acidification, which is a result of increase in temperature in the atmosphere through global warming and climate change, you also have the threat of extremely large, unsustainable commercial fishing, which is not taking into account how these animals actually need time to breed and bring back their populations from the brink, even so that we can continue to have seafood in the future. And more closer to land, rampant coastal development, which not only affects this land and sea interface, it can actually make us more vulnerable, with extreme climatic events, and a lot of these ecosystems which get affected. But there are numerous ways in which we are introducing pollutants into the water. And speaking of pollutants, I'm sure everyone probably is a little tired or numb, or even feeling a little overwhelmed by the plastic or trash problem. And the truth is, eventually it is ending up in all of our ecosystems, especially in the oceans. So after learning a lot about how beautiful these ecosystems can be, but then ending with how a lot of these are actually not in their best of health, can sometimes, sort of bring us down a little bit. And the truth is, there is still hope. There are areas that are thriving. There are now more than ever, more people have come to the forefront, with whatever their background might be. So it's not just, we don't just need biologists and conservators or people who've studied wildlife biology. We need lawyers, we need journalists, we need people who can in some way affect policy. We need teachers. And so a common question I'm always asked is, how can everyone or anyone get involved, even if they don't say go on a dive, or they don't know much about these ecosystems but feel that they want to help in some way. And rather than giving very larger sort of takeaways, there were some that I wanted to give from my own experience from the time that I've spent in the Andamans. And that would be that there is actually no substitute for spending time in the outdoors. And in this, since we're talking about marine life, actually in some way or the other having a way to interact with the ocean, whether it's going on walks on the beach, wading into a tide pool, just swimming in the ocean, if not getting a chance to go underwater. And when you do this, to do your research, speak to people, maybe go through reviews and support responsible tourism that does not encourage coming in contact with marine life, that in any way is encouraging a sort of harmful interaction with marine life. Support operators or outfits that are responsible with the way they are when they're in the ocean, not dropping their anchor or throwing pollutants into the water where or not dropping the anchor where there are reefs, or even how they function on land. How do they manage their waste? How do they use their electricity? These are all small ways in which you can actually send tourism in the right direction and make it more useful as a tool. And as simple as curbing the use of disposables. And then when you do go on a beach, if anything, if you had to collect anything, I would say any trash that you see, rather than things like shells and corals. And through the example of the hermit crab, even something like an empty shell still has value in the ocean. And if you are someone who eats seafood, then there are options to make more sort of responsible choices without having to do any of the science yourself. In-season fish and know your fish are some examples. And next week, Pooja Rathod, who is one of the founders of Know Your Fish, will actually be talking to you more about this. And to end with, as much as we all can make a difference on our own, we do have to participate in campaigns, whether it could be through letters or through petitions that actually are trying to get much larger scale changes made in things like policy and in management. And at the end of the day, stay connected with nature. And with that, I'd like to end.
Thank you, Chetna. Just before going for question answers, can you take your slide to the I think third one from the last, where you have shown fishes being fed and someone. Huh. So here I just wanted to ask that there are some sports like this where they take you underwater and give you these things to bread and something to feed. So I have seen these things rampant in Bali and some other areas. So this is completely no-no, right?
Yeah, it's a complete no-no. It's similar to why we would not want to feed wild animals on land. So it can cause a whole range of issues. Firstly, because it's not its natural diet. It can actually cause diseases. A lot of the times, these might happen in the same location and actually alter the behavior of these fish, where they actually don't start going and continue to find food on their own. And these are sort of aggregations of fish that would not be coming otherwise, which actually then makes them more prone to predation. There are so many of these different reasons why we should not be feeding fish. In fact, without feeding fish, you can actually spend lots of time with them up close. But yeah, otherwise a definite no-no. In fact, it's illegal in many places.
Okay, and the another photo is where they are standing on the coral leaf, or
So yeah, what is happening in this picture is the couple of people who are standing on the reef, uh, and which is I think partly on a live coral and partly on sand. But even sand can have animals, so these are all habitats. So no, just the standing on a coral can vary. Even if you pinch a coral with your two fingers, you can actually crush a bunch of polyps together. And so my guess from this picture, which I found on the internet, is that these are people, either they're going on their dive for the first time, in which case they should not be let on their own. Maybe it was for a picture, but in 30 seconds, they've actually created a lot of local damage. Or these are people who are learning how to dive, but their instructor is really not doing a good job of teaching them awareness in the water. So another way to support responsible tourism is to go to dive schools and dive outfits that prioritize the health of the ecosystem as they teach you.
okay, great. So now I guess quickly let's start question answers, because we are again saying sorry that we have kept you waited and did not allow you for chats and mic permission. So you can unmute yourself and one by one you can ask questions. And meantime, those who have their questions handy, you can write down in the chat box. We'll take those also. So Yashika will take care of that.
Can I ask question?
Yes.
Yeah. My son's question is, how does the clownfish poop?
How does the clownfish poop? It poops like any other animal. You can actually see it coming out like tiny strings.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll maybe be as thin as your hair. But
Okay.
you can see it. It might, I mean, I'm not exactly sure of the color. It'll depend on what it eats that day. So not very different from us.
Does it pee also, or just a poop with that uric acid, something like that?
I think they also pee. All fish will pee. So
Oh,
there's poop and there's pee, and they are important sort of nutrition that the rest of the animals in the ocean need. So fish pee is important.
okay. Thank you.
That's a wonderful question for that age, and he seems very curious.
Yeah, ma'am, can I ask a question?
Yes, you can go ahead. No
Yeah,
need to ask, you can go ahead.
yeah. Ma'am, Manveer here. I just want to know that where we can explore the marine life more properly. Like I have done scuba diving in Goa, but there was not so much of corals or anything else. So where we can explore.
So I would say easily accessible place, maybe once things slowly open up. Definitely Goa has marine life, but the problem is maybe the conditions are such that the water will have a lot of sediment, right? So the water might be quite murky. So the other option could be Nethrani, which you can also access either from Goa or from Murudeshwar in Karnataka. And otherwise, Pondicherry on the other coast, there's actually a place where an artificial reef has been constructed using rope and coconut fronds. They've submerged an Omni, and there's a lot of marine life that has come there after they've created this artificial reef. Otherwise, there's Gulf of Mannar. But if you have the chance, if you want to be able to go to a place which has a lot more clearer water, something like the Andamans or maybe Lakshadweep. So it's not like these places are poorer because the visibility is not good. It's just basically the geography of how these places like Goa are. Andamans and Lakshadweep, there's really white sandy beaches. They're not that, there's no rivers, right? So in a way, the water there is a lot clearer. But definitely, these are places that are quite easily accessible when you manage to get the time. So I would say take a week maybe and go there.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah.
Good morning, ma'am. Lakshmi here.
Hi.
Ma'am, my question is, which is your favorite ocean movie?
Oh, I actually haven't seen that many, but I think off the top of my head, one was Chasing Coral, which I think is also on Netflix. Because yeah, like halfway through the movie, you forget that you're not looking at an animal on land, which is your otherwise charismatic animal, but these are actually corals. And by the end of it, I had tears in my eyes. I think it tells the story of coral reefs really beautifully. So I do encourage everyone to see it. And My Octopus Teacher, I think hands down, it's one of the most beautiful movies I've seen. And it's the story of just one octopus.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello, ma'am. Namaste.
Hello.
Hello, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is, what are the factors to be considered to say either the corals are present in a particular place like Netrani and another places like there is no corals or corals are polluted? Because you explained about the Goa and Netrani, no? So what are the factors to consider to say corals are fine in the particular area?
That's actually a really good question. I think that one thing is that corals, I didn't go into too much detail about this, but corals need certain type of conditions. So they need a temperature range. So it may, in India at least, not colder than say 26 degrees Celsius and not warmer than 30, 31 degrees. So they need that optimum temperature. And in addition to that, the water should be somewhat clear. There are some corals that need very clear water and some that can survive even if the water is not that clear. But usually for really large, full, like complex reefs, some amount of good visibility, so light can penetrate in, is important. And usually shallow areas. So in India, a lot of the coral reefs are usually maybe the deepest is 30 or 40 meters. In Andamans and in places like the Andamans and maybe in many parts of mainland India, coral reefs can start actually at 0.5 meter or 1 meter. So they are found more shallow because again they need so much light. And in today's time, there may actually be places around mainland India that had coral reefs, but because of fishing practices that that conduct bottom trawling, these are habitats that might actually have been sort of removed just because of how these heavy nets are dragged through the ecosystem. And to some degree, I think it's just the history of how coral reefs have evolved in these areas. So I would say shallow water, clear water, and definitely not that many pollutants. So in places where there may be rivers with a lot of runoff with pollutants, that might also affect coral health. But I think you can access these maps of India where coral reefs are located.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you. Yes.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Hi.
Ma'am, first of all, I'd like to say I really liked your presentation. It was really informative.
Thank
I
you.
just have one question. As you said, much of the ocean is not discovered till now. So there must be some regulatory norms as to how far from land could you go, or how deep can you go, like what all can you discover? How do we know that then?
Actually, when it comes to how far can you go and where all you can go, in a way, there are actually no rules like that. For example, closer to land, you do have things like marine protected areas. Like how you have national parks and tiger reserves on land, you do have such areas, marine protected areas across the world, to as a way of protecting marine life, whether it's coral reefs or kelp forests. It depends from place to place. But in general, to explore, there aren't that many regulations. So, in fact, there is a certain territory, a certain body of water along every continent, beyond which it's called the high seas. So it doesn't belong to any country. And in fact, that's why sometimes a lot of piracy happens, and this is usually your open ocean and your deep ocean habitat. So that's why sort of no particular country regulates it. It's open access for all, and there are treaties that countries have signed to agree to protect it. But it's a very gray area. So if you are an explorer, perhaps apart from maybe getting certain kinds of permissions for what kind of vessel you are going in and things like that, I don't think there should be any restrictions as such. But I'm not sure of how much the Navy might control. So I know that there are a lot of shipwrecks around India, many historical shipwrecks, but those locations are not disclosed. So there may be certain, nuances like that.
Right. Thank you, ma'am.
So before going for next question, team, can you put it? We have a feedback form in the chat box. Please fill that form while we are doing question and answers. Please do that. It's certainly helping us for improving our session. Yes, you can go ahead for the next question, those who want to ask.
Hello, ma'am. Good morning. Good afternoon. Ma'am, there is this particular page I follow on Instagram wherein I think as a part of a revival of a coral reef, they build these huge sculptures and then they put it underwater. And then after a point of time, you see that there are many corals that are growing on these sculptures. So how exactly are these sculptures helping the corals?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. So, similar to what I had mentioned about the artificial reef that is being created in Pondicherry on the East Coast, one of the major problems that corals are facing is that when something like a mass bleaching event happens, which causes large tracts of coral to die, they actually will crumble, and eventually those structures might not actually exist, or it will be really denuded, broken down. And in some places that actually becomes like rubble, and it's just constantly moving around on the sand every time there are waves. And those are actually really poor habitats for new baby corals to grow, because they need something stable. It's not, if one day they're going to be looking up at the sun and the next moment they're going to be smothered by sand, they will not survive. So one of the things they need for new corals to grow and survive, and therefore so that we can get reefs, they need stable surfaces. So these sculptures would be an example of providing a habitat, so that small corals, when they are reproduced, they're thrown in like eggs into the water. They slowly grow into small larvae, and eventually when they're big enough, they land on a surface and start growing as the coral that you've seen. So they will actually look for stable surfaces, and they can actually choose. So these structures will probably look like a much better place for them to settle down for the rest of their lives than maybe some rubble around it. So those sculptures may be one example. In India, a lot of the times people create cement blocks in different shapes, which mimic how coral reefs, healthy coral reefs would look, you know, a lot of different hiding places. So I would say they're trying to provide a habitat, and so that already existing wild coral babies can come and attach. So some people go to the extent of making the structure, but also growing coral. Like they'll take coral, grow them in the lab some more, and then bring them back and produce. So that's like a even more intensive restoration project. I
Okay,
hope
ma'am.
that answers your question.
Yes, ma'am, it does. Thank you.
So any other questions?
Good afternoon, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Ma'am, my question is how these coral protect themselves from other predators, and is there any self system?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Ma'am, how these coral protect themselves from other predators, and is there any self system?
Okay, so if you remember the pictures that I had shown you of the zoomed in picture, firstly the calcium skeleton in a way is protection on one level, because a lot of animals actually cannot break that down, and the other way is the actual polyp is hiding in the calcium structure for most of the day. They open up and bring their tentacles out at night when most of their predators are not awake. So those little tentacles and the polyp itself is the main animal. So these tentacles also have stinging cells, so it helps them catch food, but I think to some extent it'll also help them as a defense. But otherwise they stay hidden inside their coral homes. So maybe what you can do is, if you Google coral colony where the polyps are open, it will look very different from the photos that I showed you. So what I was showing you is the skeleton. Yeah. So there are a lot of fish like butterfly fish that feed on corals. So they can't break the calcium, but they have a mouth almost like a straw. So they suck out the coral polyp from inside the skeleton. So every once in a while, some polyps will go.
Okay, ma'am, thank you.
So Chetna, there is so much of discussion happening on coral. Let me ask you a quick question. So all the corals, they get this color from how they get that so many vibrant colors. What is the secret behind that?
So the secret actually is because the color is coming from the algae that it's allowing to live inside its body. So the actual color of the coral is white, which is the color of this calcium skeleton, which is why it's also called bleaching when it lets go of the algae. So the color is the pigment that is in the algae. So that's why if your algae is brown, and there will be thousands of these algae in each coral polyp in an entire colony, which gives it the brown color. Same with the orange and the yellow. So it's all actually just the color of the algae that lives inside them. So without them, their color is actually white. But more recently, scientists have found out that if you were to look at coral with a UV light, they actually give a sort of phosphorescence, almost like a neon color. And that is thought to be from the coral animal itself. It's a byproduct again. The actual what do you say, the use of those chemicals is like a sunscreen on the coral's body to protect it from excessive sun, and as when you see it under a UV light, it looks fluorescent.
Okay. So apart from giving color, what is the beneficial thing from algae to coral?
So the color is actually, I don't think that important at all. The algae actually give almost 90% of the nutrition the coral needs.
Okay.
So without these algae, these corals actually won't be able to survive. But the important thing to remember is that all coral don't have these algae. There is all the, the soft coral, the fan coral, all of the corals that you have deeper down in the ocean actually don't have this algae at all. They will use their own tentacles to capture plankton and feed on them.
Okay, wonderful. So this is completely a new thing. Okay. So any questions? Please ask. We have last 3 minutes. At 12:15 we will stop. And please even fill up the forms also, feedback form. Yes, go ahead. Anyone has any question?
Yes, ma'am. This is my last question. See, my question is there any place to suggest to a Marine National Park? So, did you any idea to suggest a place
to go visit?
No. Actually,
okay.
if you got a chance to, yeah.
No, I didn't understand. If I had to make a national park.
No. He is asking if there is any marine national park in the India.
Yeah. There are actually many. One that comes to mind is there's one in Gulf of Kutch. There's one in Gulf of Mannar. Then in the Andamans, you have the Rani Jhansi Marine National Park, and you have the Mahatma Gandhi Marine National Park. And these are places that you can also visit as a tourist. Like certain sections of it might be open for you to go visit.
Okay.
Sorry, ma'am. My question is, if you got a chance to declare a Marine National Park, which is the place to suggest?
Okay.
I actually don't know. I haven't thought about it actually, because I feel that there are so many parts of the ocean that are important and that need to be protected. But the kind of protection they need, I don't think will come from a national park, because I would say one of the most severe problems is ocean temperature rising, which is coming from increase in air temperature, and that is not going to stop at the boundary of a national park. So a national park may have lots of coral reefs, but if the temperature increases in all of the Indian Ocean, that will bleach, which is exactly what has been happening in the past few years. So I would say that I would have to think about it a little more. But as of now, given a choice, I may not actually make a national park.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
So there was, I think, one more question. Is there any last question? We can take it.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. So can you tell us about something illegal trafficking of marine species?
I think that I can name some species, but I don't know the say current status or the the actual details about any of them. So on one hand, you have any extraction, which is, so you have live trade on one hand, but you also then have extracting, different kinds of marine animals for some consumption or the other. But I think that for a very long time, corals were extracted for ornaments and jewelry, which is actually what I thought coral was as a kid, was earrings. I didn't actually think of them as animals from the ocean, but there was a lot of illegal removal of coral. And if you look at the Wildlife Protection Act, along with tigers and deer, coral is on that list. Different kinds of sea cucumbers, some species of sharks, some types of snails. So because what do you say, different kinds of shells, right, which we call conches, which you might have seen in showcases or in aquariums. A lot of them, if they are genuine from the ocean, many species are critically endangered today. So actually having them in possession can be illegal. So sometimes also it's happening unknowingly. So when people go on the beach to collect shells, a lot of the times these are critically endangered species. So even if you are not killing the snail and taking only the shell, just having it is also can be illegal. In places like the Andamans, they will actually check you and scan you in the airport. But even if they are not endangered listed species or not, I would encourage everyone to not collect anything from the beach, because even if it's a broken shell, that's what eventually gets crushed to become beach sand. And you need tons of new beach sand every year for a beach to look a certain way.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, wonderful. So, Chetna, with this, we are coming to the end of this wonderful session. And before giving it to our team for official vote of thanks, I would like to say a few things. So thank you very much, all of you. And I really want to thank Symbiosis School of Banking and Finance, the director of Institute, Dr. Manisha Ketkar, who is a real support for our biodiversity cell. Means, let me tell you, all of you students and who are here, that that is one director from all others. I'm not hard much comparing, but she is always helping me in all our wildlife and biodiversity activities from the starting. And I guess SSBF is the first institute which has official biodiversity cell of their own institute. So that's a fantastic initiative. And again, thanks to Dilip Ambarkhane sir, who is holding that, spearheading that biodiversity cell from the starting. And I really thank SSBF for the same. And thanks Deputy Director also, Trupti Bhosle ma'am, who had joined today. Hello Trupti ma'am, if you are here, thanks for joining us. And now over to our team. Samita, you can go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I would like to thank Ms. Chetana Purushotham for enlightening us with her knowledge today. Today's session was very informative and revealed some interesting fact. It's true, ma'am, of what you said, that we have very little knowledge about the aquatic life, and we learned a lot of new things, new information today. Like, after listening to you today, it makes us curious to go and explore such a beautiful part of our environment, which we are actually scared of. Some of us are scared of. But then it's really interesting to see all that marine life. It was very amazing to know how aquatic creatures have various body shape and the various feature which helps them to adapt the underwater conditions. And some of which you showed us, like boxfish, the lionfish. The shape of, those creatures was very captivating. And during this situation where everyone is staying indoors and we hardly get a chance to go out, it was like a small tour for us underwater. Also, ma'am, it's very important for all of us to realize that every individual has to contribute in some or the other way to protect our marine life. It was a very inspiring session, ma'am. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank Trupti ma'am and Dilip Ambakani sir for always supporting us and joining us today. And I thank all the attendees for joining and being part of today's session. I believe everyone had a great time. And finally, I thank Shilpa ma'am and all the student volunteers for organizing this session. Once again, thank you so much, everyone. And now I